Hi folks, and welcome to the first and perhaps only video lecture on Baudry's apparatus theory. We're going to be talking mostly about perspective and some of his intellectual forebears, where he gets his ideas from. So let's look at the title really quickly. Ideological Effects of the Basic Cinematographic Apparatus. Those two terms are going to be crucial for us, ideology and apparatus. I want to have a loose understanding of what those terms might mean before we get into the more technical understanding of what those terms mean. Apparatus being the technical equipment or machinery needed for a particular activity or purpose. Ideology being a system of ideas and ideals, especially one which forms the basis of economic or political theory and policy. To understand the basis of the argument that Baudry is making, we can simply look at the diagram that he gives us. And I don't even need to work through the detailed permutations of the diagram. I just need you to see the distance between objective reality and spectator. What Baudry is trying to do is emphasize all the ways in which objective reality is transformed in the making of a cinematic work. And he'll say it this way: cinematography thus refers to a work that is to a process of transformation. You should always remember that at this point in the class, as we're dealing with French film theory from 1968 and onward, we're dealing with film theory of suspicion. That this is no longer the enthusiastic film theory that tried to celebrate what makes cinema distinct from the other arts. Here, what we're trying to do, even if we're still talking about what makes cinema different from the other arts, is we're trying to find out the ways in which cinema has, through its specificity, been so successful at aligning itself with the dominant ideology. Why is it so pervasive as a mass cultural item? And why is it one of the main instruments of Hollywood that perpetuates largely bourgeois ideology, normative thinking, not radical, not revolutionary, but capitalist. Before we go into the details, and I'm not going to go into detail in all of these, but I want to emphasize the first section, I just want us to understand the simplest argumentative points that Baudry is making, because the language is so difficult and the references are so many that it's hard to read and get a big picture view of what he's trying to argue. So I want to use this as a kind of very reductive, but I'm hoping useful guide to what each section is more or less trying to do. So the first section, the eye of the subject, is basically telling us that linear perspective is bad and that cinema is condemned to linear perspective. The second section, projection, difference denied, is basically saying the synthesis of movement from still frames, which cinema does because it is an illusion of movement from the succession of still frames, that thing is basically a form of lying. Why? Because it's concealing the material fact of its still images, and you don't see the still images, you only see movement. The transcendental subject section, which is harder to summarize, is saying something like camera movement, continuity editing, and narrative continuity are synthesized in our minds to create the impression of reality. But that impression of reality is the result of that synthesis that our minds are doing, and that synthesis makes us feel good, but it's false. So notice the progression from talking about movement itself to talking about things that we associate with cinematic style, or the things that authors do. You move the camera, you edit things, you create stories. Those are the things of, say, Hollywood cinema proper, and he's trying to tell us that gives us a kind of satisfaction of seeing a complete, continuous world, and that our minds are the ones that are putting those things together, synthesizing them, and that makes us feel like self-knowing, complete subject. The screen mirror section is basically saying that movies are identification machines, and that feels good, but it's false. Movies make us identify on some degree with what the camera is seeing, and also with the characters that we identify with through narrative storytelling techniques. And that feels great, but it's false. So now let's talk about the eye of the subject in a little bit more detail. It's all about Renaissance perspective. And as I told you earlier, the idea is that perspective is bad. So the idea that perspective is bad, or to put it in a more nuanced way, that perspective is not ideologically neutral, has been argued before. In fact, it was argued by Erwin Panofsky, an art historian and art theorist, in a book called Perspective as Symbolic Form. Now, to understand the idea that perspective, that is Renaissance perspective, linear perspective, that idea rests on this word, the subject. Now, we're going to see this word subject a lot in the writings of, say, French post-1968 film theory. What does that word subject mean? It seems obvious, but I wanted just to make sure we're all on the same page. So Baudry will say that the system of Renaissance perspective, which has its grounding in the technology of the camera obscura, recentering or at least displacing the center, which settles itself in the eye, will ensure the setting up of the subject as the active center and origin of meaning. Now, there's a footnote that I think is pretty helpful if you're just approaching this kind of word for the first time. Notice that the footnote says, the term subject is used by Baudry and others to mean not the topic of discourse, that is, what is the subject that you're talking about, but rather the perceiving and ordering self, as in our term subjective. So these phrases are going to become very useful. Perceiving and ordering self, the active center and origin of meaning. And if you're not familiar with this kind of writing, you could just read that as saying, yeah, what's the problem? I'm a subject. I am the active center and origin of meaning. I am a perceiving and ordering self. What else could I be? It's easy to think that way, but I want us to remember, and actually I want to show you that this term comes with it a kind of critique. So it might not be clear, but when Baudry is saying that perspective ensures the setting up of the subject as the active center and origin of meaning, that isn't necessarily a very good thing. So where is he getting this idea, and why is that not a good thing? Well, let's look to one of Baudry's comrades, someone who's writing Marxist philosophy that's inspiring to him. So remember this little note that Baudry makes when he's talking about the idea of the work. He says, the question becomes, is the work made evident? Does consumption of the product bring about a knowledge effect, or is the work concealed? And he's just talking about this idea that cinema tends to conceal the transformations that are endemic to the production of movies. Wouldn't it be nice if we had a mode of making movies that revealed those transformations? And he's quoting this idea of a knowledge effect, that thing that would, say, bring out the work. He's quoting a French Marxist thinker named Louis Althusser. Now, who is Louis Althusser? He wrote this really influential work called Ideology and Ideological State Apparatuses, published in 1970. And he'll define the subject this way. He'll say, in the ordinary use of the term, subject in fact means, 1, a free subjectivity, a center of initiatives, author of and responsible for its actions, and 2, a subjective being, a subjected being who submits to a higher authority and is therefore stripped of all freedom except that of freely accepting his submission. Being a subject manifests the sense that you might have that you are the author of and responsible for your own actions, that you know yourself, but also the idea that you feel as if you were a free subjectivity, that you are a center of initiatives, author of and responsible for your own actions, that you know yourself clearly and transparently, that you understand your motivations. That idea is going to be critiqued, and they want to say that the reason you think that is because of number 2, that you submit to a higher authority without realizing it, that everything that you think has been kind of taken down from ideology. So that while 1 and 2 seem contradictory for thinkers like Althusser and Baudry, they are mutually constitutive of each other. So I think it's maybe useful to summarize what a subject is for these French Marxist thinkers. And this is not a quotation, this is my own summary. To think of a human being as a subject is to think of human beings as free, isolated individuals who are solely responsible and answerable for the outcomes of their actions, rather than individuals who are determined by larger social forces. One really simple way of understanding why this subject emerged as this term, and why we would be really critical of the idea that you are, say, responsible for and answerable for the outcomes of your actions rather than determined by larger social forces, is that at this point in 20th century thought, the influence of Karl Marx and Sigmund Freud are so huge that we're getting a paradigm shift in philosophical thought of what it means to be a person and how you access your own thoughts and understandings of your own behaviors. Freud, even if you don't understand the workings of Freud, you know that he's trying to tell you that there are things that you do that you don't understand. That's the unconscious. And Marx is trying to tell you that even though that you think you're happy, you are actually exploited by a capitalist system that doesn't care about you. And Marx will use the term ideology directly to talk about why you are under a sense of false consciousness. So Marxist and Freudian thought kind of blend and merge together and create all these other kind of forms of thought that are critical of this idea of the subject. So back to Althusser. What does he say about subjects? Well, he says all ideology has the function of constituting concrete individuals as subjects. Right, so being a subject is not a good thing. It's a sense of falseness. You think that you know yourself because ideology has permeated your brain. It also kind of ingrains itself in actual material things and ways of being. So he'll say an ideology always exists in an apparatus and its practice or practices. For example, he'll say, Pascal says more or less, kneel down, move your lips in prayer, and you will believe. In other words, Althusser is trying to make a distinction. He's trying to say that we usually think of ideology as a set of beliefs that you have that determine the kind of actions or behaviors that you'll take in life. He wants to say the opposite, that maybe the actions and behaviors that you make in life and the forces that lead you to make those actions and behaviors are the things that lead to your beliefs, aka ideology. So now we can see some resonance here with Baudry and why he thinks that the apparatus of cinema has ideological effects on us. Yes, he is in some sense trying to allegorize the apparatus of the cinema, but he also talks about the way in which the cinematic apparatus makes us conform our bodies to certain positions, right? Actions, rituals, behaviors that themselves have ideological effects, right? You are immobile and in the dark and looking forward away from the actuality of the projector. Those things actually matter, and they kind of conform to Althusser's idea that ideology might follow from actions rather than vice versa. So that's just a brief detour to understand the larger ideas. Let's talk about the eye of the subject, because the most influential idea from Baudry really is this perspective thing, even though it lasts about 2 pages long. He'll say, the painting of the Renaissance will elaborate a centered space. The center of the space coincides with the eye, which Jean Pellerin Viator will so appropriately call the subject. The principal point is perspective should be placed at eye level. This point is called fixed or subject. Our pal John Berger in his BBC miniseries actually puts this idea in an even more simple and useful way. He says, perspective centers everything on the eye of the beholder. It is like a beam from a lighthouse, only instead of light traveling outwards, appearances travel in. Perspective makes the eye the center of the visible world. What Baudry wants to do is take this basic idea and say there's something ideologically pernicious about this. So the idea, and I hope this is reinforced by looking at the kind of invisible lines made visible that constitute linear perspective, right? The vanishing point is the point at which all of the lines converge. You can imagine that this painting imagines a centered and single individual spectator, that the very image itself in its realism seems to position a person right in front of it. The painting is both a representation of a set of objects, that is these people who are, representations of dead philosophers, and these architectural spaces. But it's not just that, it's also in its very construction of that realistic, geometrically precise space, inviting you to stand right there at the center, making it seem as if this image is flowing from your own eyes, just like when you stand at the parallel train tracks and see them converge. And we can see the same basic idea in cinema. Baudry will admit that things like different lens lengths may suppress the linear perspective of cinema, but the linear perspective of cinema is the norm. So he'll say, based on the principle of a fixed point by reference to which the visualized objects are organized, it specifies in return the position of the subject, the very spot it must necessarily occupy. In other words, Renaissance perspective is a system in which a single spectator is positioned as part of the work. It generates a vision intended for the point of view of an isolated, idealized subject. It's like all the world that you see in the painting is for you. You are the center of the painting. You are the subject of the painting, and the things in the painting are an object. If you're not familiar with this discourse, I think it's useful to actually look at paintings that are not adhering to Renaissance perspective. Of course, medieval art is a good place to look, in which you do get a semblance of three-dimensionality, but you do not get that thing that we see here. You do not get the impression that the way space is represented in the painting creates this nice little placeholder for the spectator to be part of that view. Same thing here, notably flat, radical flatness in ancient Egyptian painting. Here we get an interesting example of an attempt at depth that doesn't conform to the mathematical precision of Renaissance perspective, because the lines don't quite match up. And so you get this strange kind of feeling of knowing that it's trying to approximate the vision, but it doesn't say emplace you the way that a Renaissance perspective painting or a movie or a photograph does. Another interesting example of a non-linear perspective form of representing three dimensions is something like isometric projection, which you see here in the background in an early version of the SimCity video game. And Arnheim will actually talk about this as an example, not SimCity, of course, but isometric projection, as an example of a form of drawing that emerges in a lot more cultures than Renaissance perspective does. He says Renaissance perspective, quote, was discovered at only one time and place in man's entire history. The more elementary procedures for representing pictorial space, the two-dimensional Egyptian method, as well as isometric projection, were and are discovered independently all over the world at early levels of visual conception. So he just wants us to remind ourselves, and I think Baudry does too, about the historical specificity, also illusionistic aspects of realism that Baudry is going to be suspicious of. And here's another example of what isometric projection means. So one question we might have for Baudry that he doesn't really have a long time to address in his essay is, can stylistic choices suppress the perspective inherent to the camera? Your first answer might be, well, I've seen a lot of experimental films that actually don't look like the world, therefore they seem to suppress the perspective inherent to the camera. But I also want to introduce you to, say, less radically non-figurative moving images and some arguments that have been made in the wake of Baudry, just to show you how Baudry is part of a larger conversation. So Brian Henderson is a film theorist who wrote an essay called Toward a Non-Bourgeois Camera Style, in which he would look at sequences like this famous long lateral tracking shot from Jean-Luc Godard's Weekend, a notoriously, difficult and politically leftist film. And he's going to say, Henderson that is, Godard, like Eisenstein, repudiates the individualist conception of the bourgeois hero, and his tracking shots reflect this. His camera serves no individual and prefers none to another. In another place in the essay, he writes, Godard avoids depth. He arranges his characters in a single plane only. None is ever closer to the camera than another. So I kind of want you to wrap your heads around this discourse. You might think it a bit strange and kind of hard to swallow that people are saying that staging things in depth is ideologically suspicious. But I just want you to be familiar with the fact that this was a way of thinking, and it's not exactly gone. So this work was written in the 1980s, I believe, but we can also see it in a much more recent book about anime. So Tom Lamar is a film scholar of Japanese cinema and Japanese animation. He has a pretty interesting book called The Anime Machine, in which he makes similar kinds of arguments about the kinds of movements and spatial effects that anime tends to produce. He says the animation stand promises different ways of rationalizing the relation between planes of the image. The elements in different layers will appear to pull apart or to draw closer together as they become smaller or larger as you track in or out. The effect is like that of curtains opening and closing. I think we see that effect pretty clearly in these two GIFs. This way of looking does not encourage us to seize this place instrumentally, that is, to poke into its every corner, to plunder its treasures, to dominate and exploit it, as the bad guys are prone to do. So Lamar is going to say that this more surface-based movement that you see in these clips, notice how it's approximating a camera, but it doesn't actually have the depth effects that a camera would have on actual space. He's going to say that that can be allied in some sense with an aesthetic that doesn't, quote, poke into every corner, plunder its treasures, and dominate and exploit it, that he associates with very much Z-axis probing camera movements and basically Renaissance perspective emphasizing spatial arrangements. Okay, so that's going to do it for this little video on Renaissance perspective and ideology. And I'll see you next time.